Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I want to talk about books that I need to reread in order to properly make my top 10 books of all time list. It's a very lengthy title, but that basically summarizes what this video is going to be. So I kind of have, not a dilemma, but I have a little bit of an issue now trying to create my top 10 books of all time list. Mainly because I just don't know which books to include in like the last few spots. Like I'll go through some books that I absolutely know are in my top 10. Like they're like a lock for sure. So of course, probably like these books are in my top 5, like Storm of Swords by George R. R. Martin, Song of Ice and Fire, my all-time favorite series. That's a lock for sure. Second favorite would be Way of Kings, Stormlight Archive. Like obviously that's going to be in my top 10. My favorite Stephen King book, The Dead Zone, like that's a lock for my top 10 for sure. And then just one of my all-time favorite books, Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. That's easily top 5 book for me of all time. Might be my most reread book of all time. And then another book that's probably a lock, no pun intended, The Lies of Locke Lamora. Like that's definitely top 10. And then there's other books that I'm like 80-90% sure could be top 10 because I've reread them several times, but maybe there's books that could surpass them. Baby Teeth by Zoe Stage. I love this book, one of my all-time favorite horror books. Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. I love this book. I think I've read this book twice. Love it. Sleeping Giants, the first book in my favorite trilogy of all time. Probably one of my favorite sci-fi books of all time. And then Mr. Monster by Dan Wells. Extremely good. I love John Cleaver, one of my all-time favorite series. So like those 4 books, maybe not all of them would make the top 10, but like they're the most secure just because I've reread them several times and I know I love them. But for this video, I'm going to talk about 9 books that basically have the potential to make top 10, but in order to kind of make a more reaffirmed decision, I need to go back and reread them because I've only read these books once and I want to make sure that they're still basically top 10 worthy. Like if I were to make like a top 20, most likely all of these books would make it, but would these books make my top 10 books of all time? That's to be seen. So basically I'm just going to talk about these books and eventually I'm going to go back and reread them. I don't know if I'm going to do it this year because kind of one of my main goals is to focus on reading new books, like my books on my physical shelf specifically. So going back to reread all of these books does not really help with that goal. But maybe by the end of the year, if I've gotten a lot of that goal done, or maybe I'll even do it next year. Maybe that's a goal for next year. But I wanted to go ahead and make this video anyway, mainly because that's just what I came up with today. But anyway, that's what I'm going to do for this video. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So like I mentioned, I have 9 books here. They're obviously all 5-star reads. They're some of my favorite books that I've ever read. But I've only read these books once, and I think I need to reread them again just so I can properly distinguish if they're top 10 worthy or not. So one of them would be The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is my all-time favorite classic. I've only read this book once, and it was like maybe like 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago at this point. I remember thoroughly enjoying this book, but if I go back and reread it, is it going to have the same impact that it had a long time ago? Like, this book shocked me. Like, halfway through, there's a moment in this book that, like, really got to me. But am I going to have that same feeling if I reread it? I don't know. And also, just for classic, it's very well paced. I actually liked the writing and the prose in here. I liked the characters. Just it's my all-time favorite classic. And hopefully it stands the test of time for me. And upon a reread, hopefully it's great. This one, probably out of all of these books, has the least potential to make my top 10. But I do remember at some point, like when I first read it, I probably just, it shot up to my top 10. But over the years, it's kind of dropped down a bit. But maybe if I go back and reread it, who knows? Another recent read of mine would be Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazrica. This was my favorite book that I read in 2023, and overall, just one of the best horror books I've ever read. And it really has a lasting impression on me because I still think about this book to this day. But is it going to have the same impact if I go back and reread it? Probably. But also, kind of the problem with my top 10 is that there's a lot of horror books I have to talk about here, like horror and thriller books. So it's really just a competition of like which is going to make it. Because like I mentioned, Baby Teeth, that's a real distinct possibility of making my top 10 list. Mr. Monster by Dan Wells. Tender is the Flesh, outstanding. But is it better than those? I don't know. I'd have to reread it and see if it, still stands the test of time for me. Even though I read this book, like a couple of years ago, I still need to know. And yet again, another horror book that I need to go back and reread is Mr. Splitfoot by Samantha Hunt. This is another book, like I mentioned, with Picture of Dorian Gray. I read this book like 8 years ago. I read this book in one sitting, y'all. And I mean, I got into bed at like 7 o'clock and then did not get out of bed until I finished this book because it was so captivating and hypnotic. This book was amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The problem is it's been so long since I've read it that I don't really remember much about it. I remember loving it, but I need to go back and reread it. And like I mentioned with all these books so far, I need to see if it still stands the test of time for me. My guess is probably not. Out of all of the books I have here, maybe not. But who knows? Maybe I'll go back and love it. I did make Ian read this, and he did not really like it because me and Stacy had a little competition of making Ian read some of our favorite books, and then he rated them. He did not really rate this book highly, so now I'm questioning if I go back and read this, is it still going to be a 5-star read? Maybe, but I don't know. I'd have to go back and reread it. And I mentioned Tender is the Flesh was my favorite book that I read in 2023. The runner-up to that was Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. And S.A. Cosby is quickly becoming an all-time favorite author. And this is definitely by far my favorite by him. I give it 5 stars, obviously. And this book, it was just incredible. It read like a Tarantino movie. If you don't know, Quentin Tarantino, Pulp Fiction, my all-time favorite director. And one of the main reasons I love him is because of his dialogue and just, I love him. And this book, everything about this book is great. The dialogue, the writing, the plot. This book surprises me a lot. There's a lot of twists and turns that I do not see coming. And this author, S.A. Cosby, does not hold back. He takes risks with this book. A lot of crazy stuff happens. And I just thoroughly enjoyed this book. But does it hold up with... I've read so many great books. It's really going to be hard to justify taking any of these books out of the top 10. And like I said, all of these books would probably make my top 20 list. But yeah, this book, I have a strong feeling that this could make my top 10 if I go back and reread it. But I have to go and do so. I don't know. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. And this is one of the ones that I'm the most excited to go back and reread. And again, like with Mr. Splitfoot and Picture of Dorian Gray, I read this book a long time ago. And I really need to go back and reread it. And that would be Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami. This is my all-time favorite Murakami books. Most of his books I kind of give either 4.5 stars. I think a couple of them have given 5 stars, but this is my all-time favorite, leagues above his other books. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. The problem is, while I do remember kind of the structure of this book, because it's you're telling two very distinct, different stories, and kind of the deal is how are these going to connect in the end? That's kind of the main reason to read this book, is to figure out what's going on with that. And I do remember the feeling I had reading this book of just being in awe of it, of just like what is happening, like just very otherworldly writing. But the problem is I don't really remember like what actually happens in this book, so I need to go back and reread it and see if it holds up. Um, my my gut feeling says probably not. Like I'm still gonna probably love it, but I don't know if it's gonna be top 10 worthy, especially when I see its competition, like just with other books on my top 10 and these other books, like the competition. So I think I'm gonna thoroughly enjoy my reread of it, but will it make my top 10? It could, but maybe not. This book, out of everything, is probably like a top contender. Like I can see myself rereading this book, having a blast yet again, and it just immediately shoots into my top 10 or maybe even top 5 because I thoroughly enjoyed this book when I first read it. And that would be Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And she, is one of my all-time favorite authors. Almost everything I've read by her gets 5 stars and 4.5 stars. And this is by far and away my favorite. This is just everything I love about fiction, like great characters, and it's also dealing with classic rock and just music in general, and you're following a literal band. It's a fictional band, but like, this book is so good. Like, I want to go reread this book right now, which is a good feeling to have for a book that's potentially a top 10. But yeah, this out of everything, I think is probably the strongest contender. I could probably just slot this into my top 10 and be pretty happy with its placement. But yeah, I still need to go back and reread it, and because I might just have rose tinted glasses and just maybe I'm misremembering something, but just I remember just thoroughly enjoying this book. So this is probably the top contender here. We also have another book by another one of my all-time favorite authors, and that would be Then She Was Gone by Lisa Jewell. And again, like with some of these books, like Mr. Splitfoot and Hardboiled Wonderland, like I know I loved this book, but a lot of the details are a little foggy because I read this book such a long time ago. Like I know I thoroughly enjoyed this. It was the first Lisa Jewell book I ever read, and most of her books I do give 5 stars, or at least 4.5 stars. She's one of my all-time favorite authors, like definitely top 5. And this was the first one I read, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. And I still remember the feeling I had reading it of just kind of doom and gloom and just being in awe of like what was being revealed to the reader. And this book just like is one of the best thrillers I've ever read. So it's definitely deserving. My thing is though, like, am I still gonna love it as much as I did the first time? Like knowing kind of what I already like I said, I don't remember everything, but I do kind of remember some things. But yeah, am I gonna love it as much as I did the first time? That's kind of the same question with all these books. But this one, I kind of have a feeling won't make my top 10, but it's still an amazing book, and I can't wait to go back and reread it. The newest book on this list, not in terms of publication date, but when I read it, because I read this book last year. It was, for a while, it was my favorite book that I read in 2024 until the release of Wind and Truth, obviously. But this book is still one of my favorite horror books that I've ever read. And right when I finished it, I wanted to go back and reread it, like right then, which is a good sign. I'm, of course, talking about Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. This book really stuck with me because I read this book early in 2024, and for almost the entirety of the year, it was my favorite until Wind and Truth came out and ruined it. But this book is amazing, and like I mentioned, I wanted to go back and reread it like right after I finished it. And I love when authors take chances in their storytelling. Like they don't just kind of make very safe decisions. Like this author really went there, very out there, and I loved it for that. I loved everything about this book. And yeah, it could potentially make my top 10, but like I mentioned, like there's just a lot of competition. There's a lot of horror books on this list, so which one will win out? I don't know, but yeah, definitely a top contender. And the last one I have to mention here is a book that I read a few years back, and it immediately shot into my top 10 books of all time. It fell off a little bit just because I need to go back and reread it, like with all these books. And probably like just under Daisy Jones, like this is like the top contender or one of the top contenders. And that would be Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. This book blew me away the first time I read this. I believe it was like 3 or 4 years ago, like right around when I first started my channel. And I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I loved the horror elements. I loved the characters. And like with a lot of these books, I love when authors take chances and they don't just kind of write the same crap over and over again. This book really blew me away with the writing, the characters, the plot, the directions it went in, like how unexpected everything was, and this book, and just how cathartic it was. This book is amazing and like definitely a top contender. Like Daisy Jones in this one, that's kind of my prediction of like what will end up in my top 10 but at the end of the day, but we'll have to wait and see. Okay, so that is my video for long title here. Books that I have to reread in order to properly make my top 10 books of all time list. I don't know if I'm going to title the video that. I had to find something snappier, but that's essentially what it is. 9 books that I have to go back and reread to try to figure out what the hell is going to be in my top 10 books. Like I mentioned, you know, like there's 5 books that are like just easily in my top 5 or in my top 10. Storm of Swords, Way of Kings, The Dead Zone, Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie, Lies of Locke Lamora. And then there's like 3 or 4 books that are like really heavy contenders because I've already reread them and I know I love them. Mr. Monster, Sleeping Giants, Kings of the Wild, Baby Teeth. And then there's 9 books that have a distinct possibility of making my top 10 list. And obviously, they'd probably all make my top 20. But which one is going to make my top 10 list? I'd have to go back and reread them, which is probably going to take a while because I don't know if I want to do it all in 1 month. That would be kind of crazy. But maybe at the end of 2025, I can kind of start to do it, and then maybe it could be a project for 2026. Or who the hell knows? Maybe I'll just get inspired and do it. I'll just say fuck it, and I'll do it in 2025. I don't know. What do y'all think I should do? Down in the comments below, what should I do? And also, what is your prediction for what will be in my top 10 books of all time? And also, like, I'm always reading books and I'm always finding new favorites. So potentially I could find a book in 2025 that could shoot up to my top 10 and just kind of blow this out of the water. Who knows? But yeah, I had some fun here. Hopefully y'all did too. But yeah, what is your prediction of what will be officially in my top 10 books of all time? And I'll make that video kind of when, like after I do this crazy thing where I reread all these books. So probably next year you'll get that video from me. But yeah, hopefully y'all enjoyed this. Like and subscribe if you liked the video. What else do I want y'all to do? Patreon down below if you want to go support me there for as little as $1 a month. Have the Book of Sturman Discord where we've got tons of read-alongs and buddy reads, and we're announced the Battle of the Bands readathon that will take place exclusively on the Book of Sturman Discord in April. Join down below for that. I also have my Amazon wish list down below if you want to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.